Is Terminus no longer legacy power level?
Next on Eternal Turtles.
Stop! I need more stuff. Can't you see I need more stuff? Let's have a go.
Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles. In return, you'll get ad-free content and a bonus episode every single week. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, I'm putting Terminus down for the first time ever.
Yeah, I just noticed. Part of this episode is talking about maybe Terminus not being legacy power level, and the other part is about what to do about that, right? Like, if you still want to be a control deck, you do need to find something that is legacy power level to do in a control deck. Just being control by itself is not, a legacy power level thing to do, which is, as far as the ABC guide to deck building is concerned, that is the first step, right?
Yeah,
that is the A.
That is the A, and that has always been under the assumption that clearing the board meaningfully would help your game plan of going long. But that is sort of just not where the format is. Yes, Nadu decks still show up and do well, and yes, they do play mana dorks, and usually Terminus wants to run into decks that are playing, fucking Birds of Paradise. The difference, though, is that when they're playing, the times where Terminus has always been like a valuable tool is when it needs to clean up stuff that it otherwise doesn't want to trade its 1-for-1 cards with. So sure. At a time when Baleful Strix was everywhere, right, you never want to trade your Swords to Plowshares with Baleful Strix. So a Baleful Strix would just sit on the table until one player would either not do anything, like not extend into a Terminus, that way it wasn't a favorable trade, in which case the game would just go long while this bird chips away until it doesn't matter that you trade 1-for-1 because we have so many resources and we're over-indexed and we can just throw at stuff.
That's a best-case scenario for control.
It falls into the game plan of like what control wants to do, which is just go like super deep if you're not extending. Now, in the times where where Baleful Strix was playable, and they did put another threat on the table that didn't recoup a card, it's like, okay, now we're at mana parity, card parity, because Baleful Strix replaced itself. The other threat theoretically didn't replace itself, and Terminus swept up both of them, which means that we have exchanged an even number of cards, even though, on the board it looks like a 2-for-1. It's not. Similarly with when Deathrite Shaman was around, it's like, yep, Deathrite Shaman doesn't actually recoup a card, so when you play it, if you put anything else on the table, even if it did recoup a card, like you sweep it and then like you were up a card. People will remember the olden days of Check Pile where Terminus was excellent because Deathrite Shaman and Leovold, neither of which actually recouped a card initially, and Terminus being able to sweep up both was an excellent exchange for you because it actually goes up a card and mana. Wonderful. Yeah. Those days just don't exist anymore. Where we are currently at is if you are playing, if somebody plays a Noble Hierarch across the table from you, it is presumed that they are on one of two decks. One is Infect, which is combo, or one is Nadu, which is combo. Same thing if you are playing something like Cephalid Breakfast and they are playing a creature deck where, yes, theoretically Terminus is great, but the combo of the creatures means that the game is dead on the spot if you haven't done the work to set up the Terminus and then be able to time it correctly. And without a reliable tool to do that consistently, a la a Sensei's Top type effect, that means that you have to have additional mana on top of it, in which case it's not actually a 1-mana Wrath. It's a whatever mana was spent to set it up, plus whatever mana was set to trigger the miracle, and then also the white mana to cast the miracle. So,
Phil, I have a quick question. Have you ever won a game against Cephalid Breakfast where you Terminus and put all their creatures under and they lose on the Thassa's Oracle trigger?
So there
that's possible, right?
It is possible. It typically doesn't work that way because they would have the Cabal therapy at the time, so they could always strip whatever it was when, like, if we have gotten to that point and they know that, like, if you're playing against a good breakfast player and they know that you're on Terminus, like, and they know that that's the one card that can strip you, and they just do the math of like, okay, what are the instant speed cantrips or whatever that could get me here? It's typically Brainstorm, right? And if they Cabal therapy you before they get to that stage of where they put all the creatures into play, like, they can play around it. So, you can get somebody who's just not thinking about what they could lose to. But good breakfast players care about a very a low subsection of cards that actually can beat them when they're comboing off. So a little less so. And then even if you do that and get there, it's
Clue
like
token.
they would have to Dread Return, and like, there's just it's a whole thing. Anyway, all that is to say that the Terminus against any of the decks that are playing creatures right now it's like, okay, well, a lot of the creatures in the format, they just don't have to extend beyond what they already do. Like, they can just play the singular threat and then make you answer it in some fashion. Like, you can't just sit there and take 3 from a Delver or a Dragon Rage Channeler, consistently while the game is being set up, because you are under the pressure is on you to convert. And if you can convert your Terminus for a 1-for-1, suddenly that's actually really good. But like, not really good in that, like, this is a playable archetype. Really good in that, like, oh wow, my Terminus didn't go down cards.
Yeah.
Like, the paradigm has just shifted so dramatically. And there was a point where it's like, if you're playing against like Cradle Control or actual aggro Eldrazi before sowing Michael Spawn, like, there was argument for like, oh yeah, no, like, cleaning up a bunch of things because the Thought Not Seer gives you the card back, so it's like, not, even though it's disruption, it's not necessarily a full exchange. They're playing, a bunch of cards that aren't drawing them cards in ways where now that just doesn't exist, right? MH3 has also changed Eldrazi so that every card draws a card or gets some sort of value.
Yeah.
Long way. Zach, I say all that to say this, Zach.
You did it.
I don't
do it
think that
faster.
Terminus
I say all that to say this.
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel.
Saying all that to say this, Zach, I don't think that Terminus is actually in a position to be the powerful thing that is worth spending time to try and convert, because a lot of decks just don't care about it. Now, okay, so what can work in that spot? Well, last theory episode, when we were talking about control, I was talking about how you have to adhere to where the format is. And the format, I think, is in a space where it's really hard to play anything that's a 3-drop that doesn't either lock somebody out or really, press the advantage in some astronomical way. And otherwise, I think, like, it's just not worth the time of trying to make something happen. And so I've been trying out a bunch of different things. And then I was like, okay, well, what is actually a card that would work replacing the Terminus? And right now, like, Urza Saga is still around in meaningful ways. And that was always difficult with Terminus as well, because if you wanted to convert the Terminus in your draw step, it meant that you took a chunk of damage because the creatures were put into play at awkward timing for a Wrath. So if you weren't instant speeding the Wrath, which is where I was like, at a certain point, I was like, oh wow, Deduce is actually the truth for Miracles in being able to always have draw cards sitting on the table. That way, whenever you did have Mystic Sanctuary plus whatever, you would always be able to convert that thing without going down cards. Or the 2 cards that are built into the Deduce would essentially offset the cards that Terminus would go down, so you would stay at card parity. And if you were exchanging mana, and as long as you had the mana development to get through, then it didn't matter. Like, that wasn't the access that mattered. So you would be able to, as long as you could keep the board clear and not die and stay at mana parity, your deck would eventually overtake them because your deck is designed to do that. So it's like, oh wow. For a long time, I was like, Deduce is the absolute truth, because it was solving the Terminus problem on 2 factors. It was solving it on card parity problems, and it was solving it on timing problems. And so, whenever I would, play Deduce or have good results with Deduce, or there would be readers on it, I was like, no, this is actually solving a very distinct and critical problem that the archetype of Miracles specifically had, which was timing Miracles and then actually being able to keep up on cards and doing it in a way that, like, wasn't immediate, right? Like, having just draw cards sit on the table was valuable because you wouldn't just crack it all the time. Like, you would leave it knowing that you always have a Terminus held up because there's a draw card on the table. The same way that when you had top in the olden days, you'd always know that, like, if you were floating something, you would have it at instant speed. And so the combination between Deduce and Mystic Sanctuary with a Miracle in your graveyard meant that you always had it at the ready whenever you wanted. And yes, it was a little bit more mana intensive because it wasn't, instead of 1 mana, it's 3 mana, but, like, you always had it, right? And that was the role that it was filling. Now, if we get to where that isn't even good enough, like, if we can stay at mana parity on these cards, plus we can go up, and it's still not good enough because creature combos just end the game on the spot when they touch, right? Like, now, if Nadu players put the Nadu combo on the table, you can instant speed Terminus them, and they're like, okay, I'm going to draw 8 cards in response.
Yeah.
Right? Or they can hold, and then when you say Terminus, okay, they're like, okay, draw 8 cards in response. So, like, they're actually now, even at instant speed, isn't a window, because they at instant speed can always respond to it to draw a bunch of cards, and it offsets that paradigm, which is where it was like, before you could, like, where I was like, oh no, I'm high on Deduce plus Terminus, and there were times where the Mystic Sanctuary engine with Thwart plus Terminus and Deducing and all of that meant that, like, instant speed Terminus forever was actually really viable. And you can watch a bunch of games on 90s MTG where I'm doing exactly that. Like, there's one game where I remember I was playing against Chris Benucci, who was on the dinosaurs on
Oh
a
yeah,
spaceship
yeah,
deck.
dinosaurs in space. Yeah,
And there's an insane game where like I just infinite Terminus against his infinite dinosaurs.
yeah.
And we
remember
just go
watching that.
forever. We just go
Yeah.
forever, and we're both doing these loops, and like that in those cases, it's really powerful. It's really good, but we're just not in that sort of realm anymore. So it's like, okay, what actually works? Go ahead.
You did a good point of explaining this point, but I just wanted to, before everybody gets in the comments and is like, and that's why you got to ban Nadu. You know, the answer isn't like this particular set of cards is the problem that is holding back Terminus. Is that the format has progressed, the like quality of cards has progressed so much more forward that it's no longer a viable option as far as playability is concerned. That is the argument we're setting out to make here.
I'm saying that it is also like the particular aspect of the threats is that because the design of those threats has
they're always
gone
doing something extra.
They're always doing something extra in a way that removal does not. Like the payoff for removal is if it's cheap.
Yeah.
Right? Like a 1-mana Wrath of God is very good, but like but presumably a Wrath of God is good because it's getting some number of card, like it is going up cards to some degree, which is just not, it does not happen anymore because now all the threats, it's twofold. People don't have to put more than one threat on the table if they don't want to, because every threat is good enough on its own.
Yeah.
Or if they do put multiple threats into play, it's because some number, if not all of those threats, have recouped themselves with at least +1 card or +1 resource. Yeah. And so it's not actually a favorable exchange. So that's the world we're in. And so I'm thinking, what is, at the same time, though, like you still do need something to clear creatures like, you're going to run into, 16 power off of a single Urza Saga, throughout a large tournament, several times, multiple times. Like Painter is a deck. The Nexus Tower decks are decks. Like they're all Urza Saga artifact decks. Like you will run into just big, thick beaters, but you're going to run into them at instant speed, uncounterable, and at awkward timing, where they can just do it like on multiple turns over your end step. So you can't just catch them with a singular, like sorcery speed, no more. And so I was like, okay, what is the space where, like, what is the card that can actually solve a bunch of this? And I went to Dress Down that can adhere to, Dress Down's not new to solve the construct problem, but I was looking at what can actually adhere to where I'm saying I don't want to play any 3-drops in my deck, and I want to be able to interact on my timing, not their timing. And Dress Down sort of fills the role of, A, it's good against the constructs, okay, so that's covered. And then also, it can work against, if a Nadu is put down onto the table with the combo, and you, like, if we're at that stage of the game where they're spending 3 mana to put in a Nadu, then theoretically it's presumed that you could go, okay, I'm going to Dress Down in response. You can't convert the card advantage, and then I can source the Plowshares, your threat. It doesn't get the effect because it doesn't have effects, and it's cleared the stage, and we're at card parity in that situation, right? Like you didn't, like my swords traded for your Nadu, my Dress Down replaced itself, and so I'm not down that card. So we are at parity and mana parity. If that was what was spent, and you haven't actually recouped any cards. So like in that position, that works because it is doing what Terminus no longer can. Yeah. Right.
And in that scenario, we can dive more into Dress Down.
And then on Dress Down inherently against Urza Saga, obviously not new tool against Urza Saga, but like from the standpoint of thinking about it, like Urza Saga going down, if you deal with the constructs, okay, Urza Saga still gets to fetch the piece that it's going to tutor out of your deck, in which case it doesn't go away, right? It replaces itself. Like Urza Saga inherently is a 3-for-1. And then Dress Down being able to deal with both constructs and replace itself means that the card draw on card parity is equivalent to whatever they tutored, if we're just thinking in raw cards. So same thing in that regard, you're not down cards and you've dealt with the threats. And same thing against Nadu, you're not down cards and you've dealt with the threats. And if you're unsure of like in timing, you can always Dress Down in your end step or their end step if you need it for a full turn. So you can untap and then cast on sorcery speed type things. Like there's timing that you can do. But then what that made me think of is, okay, if I'm not on Terminus anymore, but I am on Dress Down, what would that then open up if I still don't want to open myself up to removal in game 1 as a control shell. So I still like the idea of Omnises. I need more testing on that. I'm not off of that. Tune into the last episode if you want to hear why that is where I'm currently sitting until I can find some other aspect for it. But then I was like, okay, I need to pivot post board. I have learned that in the games that I have played, when I play against anything like that's like Ancient Tomb Eldrazi or Ancient Tomb, Urza's Tower, Planar Nexus type decks, I will literally board in 14 cards and still it won't be close.
Yeah.
It just still doesn't feel close. Like I'm on 4 consigns, 4 wastelands in the board, like a bunch of like it just like a faster clock. Like it doesn't matter. It just has not mattered. I've been playing mentors as a way to pivot to get faster, like just a faster threat against those decks since they don't play removal really. Has not mattered. And so I'm like, okay, well, if I want to play dress down some number in the main board to replace the Terminus, and I'm already on 4 consigned to memory in the board because it feels like you kind of have to if you're going to be able to play against the colorless decks or the Ancient Tomb decks at all in this format. If I feel like I'm necessary on 4 consigns and now I want dress downs, then I'm like, and I need a pivot plan. You'll see in my mock field that I'm now experimenting with pivoting into the Dreadnought plan post board, because if against those decks specifically, if I am boarding out all of my cards that are bad against them, and I'm going to board in the 4 consigns, I'm going to board in the 4 wastelands. Dress downs I need to keep in because they're still on Urza Saga. So if I'm boarding in the dress downs and I want to board in the consigns to memories and I want to board in the wastelands, it's like all of this is conducive to working with boarding in Dreadnoughts as the alternate threat pivot plan that I was doing in the mentor slot before, or the Shark Typhoon slot before. So now I'm experimenting with that. And this is sort of like what we talked about in the previous episode where we were talking about Last Ride. And we were saying, like, oh, yeah, you want Last Ride for whatever we were talking about, like, could you see it in Control? And I was like, well, I don't think you'd want Last Ride as the start, right? You'd want Last Ride if you wanted Snuff Out, and then you're like, oh, well, I already want Snuff Out. Therefore, I can go and look at this other piece that maybe is now an interesting,
payoff, right?
A cheaper condition to play with it. So it's like, I didn't start like, oh, I want to play Dreadnought against Eldrazi because I know that Dreadnought is good against Eldrazi. I didn't get there. I didn't start at Dreadnought. I was starting with cards I already wanted to play, which is Consigned to Memory, and now I'm in a space where I'm like, I think Dress Down is the more appropriate answer for the meta that we're in. And it's like, I'm already there, so now I can experiment with something like Dreadnought. So it's like, even though it's a Dreadnought pivot plan, it's like, when we're actually building the theory behind it, it's not a Dreadnought pivot plan. It's the Consigned to Memory Dress Down pivot plan, right? Like, I want those tools first, and then Dreadnought happens to be the cheapest, most efficient tool with the things I already want to bring in. So I'm not trying to force a Dreadnought plan.
This is also
into a Dreadnought plan.
This is also great. It's not just great against Eldrazi. There are several decks in the metagame that consign and dress down together. Like, just set up a redundancy that crushes some decks, like Doomsday, for example. If your opponent decides to lean all the way in on Cephalid Breakfast, these are also great against Cephalid Breakfast. Especially in its current form. Consigned to Memory was a card that I was very aware of, but also there's not a lot I could do against a card like that if my opponent had like 3 or 4 mana set up.
Yeah, and one thing that I was talking about in the Control Discord, which is I still think that for Control as an archetype right now, as a macro type right now, I still think that the best card in the deck is Mystic Sanctuary. I'm still
that is your legacy power level thing to do.
I still think that Mystic Sanctuary is the backbone of a reliable control deck, and implicit in that it means that some way to go long with it, a la Thwart, is still the engine for a control deck to have inevitability. Like no plan in the format can beat that infinite recursive engine. Like, you will always be able to outgrind any other deck in the format. So as a control deck, you know that inherently you will always be able to endure against anything else in the format if everything is dealt with, because you have these 5 cards in your deck, the Mystic Sanctuaries and this support. So but then the trick becomes, typically Mystic Sanctuary only wants instants and sorceries. But like, I'm looking at things like Omnises, Dress Down, like these other tools to try and keep the curve lower, because all of the instants and sorceries that I would want to play, like Entreat the Angels or 4th Aerolingus, require a ton of development that go against what we were talking about, what the constraints of the format currently are, in my opinion. So the way that like I look at my list right now is I'm like, okay, what can bridge the gap? If I can go forever, that means that if I can find one tool to bridge the gap, that I will inevitably find it. And that tool that I found is Argivian Find. Argivian Find is a white instant from Weatherlight. I believe it's Weatherlight.
It is Weatherlight,
it's a white instant. It's an instant that says return target artifact or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. So it being an instant works with the Mystic Sanctuary. And then it functions as the Mystic Sanctuary to pick up the things that Mystic Sanctuary can't. So in conjunction, now these 5 cards, Mystic Sanctuary, Argivian Find, and Thwart, mean that I can recur anything in my deck that isn't a land.
Yeah.
So before, I was trying things that could flip lands back into my deck. So if somebody were to waste land to try, had like a recursive wasteland engine or something to try and lock out the Mystic Sanctuaries, it's like, okay, I started trying to play something like Conjurer's Bauble as another 1-mana artifact cantrip that adheres to what we're talking about, but then can flip lands back onto the bottom of the deck, and then Argivian Find can loop that back. So I can prove to my wasteland lock opponent, you can't actually outgrind me. Like, I have inevitability with this. You will never actually lock me out. Unless they have an overwhelming engine where they're multiple wastelanding a turn. But if they don't have Ghost Quarter and I have the basics, then they can never actually get there. And I have enough basics to supply Mystic Sanctuary. So it's like, we can demonstrably prove, like, hey, we both can go infinite here, except I will outlast you. Because I can go forever and you cannot. And now moving back over to, okay, well, what is the stuff that we're building around? And I'm like, okay, well, I have the Wasteland package in the board. I'm boarding in 4 Wastelands instead of Back to Basics. Like the Back to Basics type stuff, because what I found was Back to Basics wasn't cutting it. I've tried other spells like Cleansing Wildfire as a way to like deal with opposing like Eye of Ugins and Karakas plus Legend that can stymie my removal going long because I can't interact with lands. So it's like all of these other tools that I was like theoretically interacting with lands. I was like, let's just go to Wasteland. And then what I've been doing is against certain decks where Wasteland is potent, a la. And particularly against decks that don't go after your mana. So we're talking anything Nadu, anything Storm, any of the Ancient Tomb, Mystic Forge style decks. Any deck that doesn't go after your mana, I've been lean enough, and where I've literally been straight swapping my basics for my Mystics, for my Wastelands out of the board. So I'll go down my 4 basics and go up my 4 Wastelands because they don't mess with my mana. And then between Mishra's Bauble and Lorien Revealed to tie the room together, Wasteland with Lorien Revealed can find your mana. So like, you can actually be this lean thing. And I thought of this tech because of conversations that I've had over the years with Delver players. Anytime I would sit down and play against a Delver player, and there was super interesting games, and we would talk about afterwards how we boarded, I would always be interested as the Delver player when they would leave their Wastelands in against a control shell that showed them sufficient basics that they have to respect Wasteland to begin with. Yeah. So if we know that post-board, I as the control deck have to respect Wasteland and fetch around Wasteland, and therefore, if you don't have a reason to play Wasteland in your deck to cast spells, your young Pyromancers of old, nowadays it's your Bowmasters, whatever. But if you don't actually have a means for the mana, the actual mana of the Wasteland, it's just a spell, I always recommend it to my Delver opponents. If you're playing against a control deck with enough basics, like knowing the plan that they can play through around Wasteland, board out your Wastelands, become a 14-land deck where you take out your Wastelands for spells, like Pyroblast or whatever, and now you're this incredibly threat-dense shell that can operate on 1 or 2 mana, knowing that your mana is never going to be disrupted. Because, like, I can't board in Wasteland against a Delver opponent. Like, they can operate on 1 to 2 mana. It would not actually solve the problem unless they actually only ever drew 1 land and never got it. But you can't plan for that. So it's like I'm not boarding in Wasteland against the deck that is hyper efficient, where the average mana cost of their deck is 0.5.
It's like, like 1/2.
We're not doing that. But so I always recommended to my Delver opponents, I'm like, if I were you playing against a deck like me that is playing sufficient number of basics to operate and it's just trying to go long and outlast Wasteland, then you just board out Wasteland, become extremely more threat dense. I still have to respect Wasteland because not everybody is on this plan. And therefore, you're getting the inherent advantage of me having to respect Wasteland, but then you get to be more threat dense and never have to draw the Wasteland. And I was like, well, I've told other players that before. Why don't I just make that part of my own plan? Now that I'm also trying to be lower to the ground as a control shell. So I was like, if a deck is not messing with my mana, then I don't need to respect that in the inverse by playing basics. So I swap out my basics and play Wasteland, and now I am just extremely more threat dense post-board because they're not disrupting me, and now my Wastelands are spells against them, and I just am this more potent, powerful deck. And Lorien Revealed is the thing that is the glue that gets to tie that room together. And so now that we're talking about all of these things all in conjunction, all at once, to like make a control shell work. And I'm like, okay, I have Argivian Find plus Mystic Sanctuary to bridge the gap for the Omnises or the other enchantments like Dress Down or whatever we're doing, so I can go forever with all of the tools in my deck except for lands. And I was like, okay, Conjurer's Bauble is the thing that I was using to be able to loop it that can tie the room together. So instead, now the package of 5 cards became 6 cards between 4 Mystic Sanctuaries, Thwart, and Argivian Find. And now I'm like, okay, the package is 7 cards. It's 4 Mystic Sanctuary, Thwart, Argivian Find, and Conjurer's Bauble. And now there is nothing that my opponents can do to outlast me. I literally can recur everything forever, always. And
as long as they don't put a Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void into play, you're set.
It is presumed that as long as you have these 7 cards like as access, then any form of graveyard disruption isn't actually relevant. So, like, if they play a Rest in Peace and don't catch at least, like, you can lose some number of Mystic Sanctuaries. The only gimmick is the Mystic Sanctuary Thwart loop is however many Mystic Sanctuaries you have, the last Mystic Sanctuary gets to target the Thwart, and then therefore you can never deck. If you are only down to 1 Mystic Sanctuary, it doesn't work because your Mystic Sanctuary always has to recur the Thwart, and then you can't recur anything else. So you're locked into always recurring the Thwart. So anything in addition to the first Mystic Sanctuary means that the first Mystic Sanctuary can target anything else, and then the second Mystic Sanctuary gets to target the Thwart. And then you can recur that loop. So for every additional Mystic Sanctuary you have, it lets you get an additional card before you have to put the Thwart back on top to go forever.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does.
So they can wasteland and then, exile 1 Mystic Sanctuary. It's not enough to cut off the loop. So you have your 4 Mystic Sanctuaries, your Thwart, your Argivian Find, and then your Conjurer's Bauble to cover lands. So you can cover instant sorceries, anything that's not instant sorceries and lands in that package. And any Mystic Sanctuary they cut down doesn't actually disrupt the package to not work. It just limits the power of how deep the Thwart can go. Okay. So if they play something, as long as they don't clip any of the other things within that package, it doesn't matter. If they play Rest in Peace, if they do whatever, you can, just play to Prismatic Ending to remove the thing. Or if it's a one-shot like a Nihil Spellbomb, if they don't clip the thing, then it doesn't matter. As long as you have access to your graveyard by the time you're going forever, you're good.
Yeah.
Then, looking at where I was with the package, and I was like, something that I haven't tested with, but I'm going to, is I was like, okay, well, the tool that I found was all of this sideboarding that I have has still not been effective against, like, the Ancient Tomb, Nexus Tower, the big mana
that's
deck,
definitely
right?
your weak spot.
It's the weak spot. And I was boarding up to 14 cards against those types of decks. I was like just not bringing in my Pyroblast, and everything else was coming in, and it was still not remotely close.
And when you told me this, my answer was, I think you just have to assume that you're losing that particular matchup. And you didn't stop. You're like, no,
I didn't stop.
I won't stop. No, I'm going to try something else.
And I think it's because Consigned to Memory has enough crossover against the stuff that white cards are bad against, because it also can clip a colorless spell. So between the triggered ability to be able to fight over the Eldrazi stuff, but then also you bring it in against Storm, Doomsday, Painter, like the combination of things, and incidentally with all the stuff that it can do, you bring it in against Oopsal spells because it can hit the Thoracle. So it has enough crossover against the stuff that white cards are bad against that, okay, it's tough to not play the full Consigns anyway. And so between all of that, I was like, the problem that then I had when I was playing against those decks is even when I would wasteland them, they would eventually just draw out because either I wasn't clocking them fast enough because Mystic Sanctuary, Monastery Mentor wasn't fast enough, and there wasn't another fast enough shell. Omnises is nice, but it still takes a lot of turns to get online, and the decks that are just looking to slam the big Haymaker, One Ring or whatever, and then you can never recover. If they're just playing the big Haymakers and they're built to be able to play through all that, then a couple of wastelands isn't good. I routinely will double wasteland, triple wasteland these types of decks in my testing, and they just play through it. They're if you're not going to clock me fast enough, and that's also where I was like, okay, well, if I can pivot into the Dreadnought plan, maybe that's fast enough. But right now, I'm also testing. The one time I'm going against my adherence to the rule of nothing more than 3 is in the Conjurer's Bauble slot. I'm testing out a Crucible of Worlds to also then post board against those types of decks rather than loop the land back underneath. If I really am this slot is dedicated to being able to recur the lands and nothing else, I'm looking at the cantrip of the Conjurer's Bauble not being necessarily as valuable as just being able to always recur the lands, and then incidentally post board against those decks if I'm wastelanding them early enough. If there's the turns where they stumble or they have 2 towers or whatever and then can't actually deploy their 4 drops yet, that if I can just get to turn 4 or 3 mana plus a land drop, then Crucible Worlds is actually a lock, and then I can prison those types of decks where Wasteland is the plan out of the game. So all this is a lot of action to talk about where my head is at about how to build a control deck, which is, okay, Terminus isn't working, therefore I want Dress Down. If I want Dress Down and I'm already playing Consigns and Wastelands, then suddenly, Dreadnought becomes interesting as the alternative plan to the alternative threat. Like, I'm not trying to Dreadnought people. I just need a fast threat. And the most efficient fast threat with the other tools that I otherwise already want just happens to be Dreadnought. I wasn't looking for Dreadnought. I was looking for the fast threat. And then looking at, okay, what in theory does my deck want to do, which is survive? And I am playing the package with the tools that are most optimized to make it so that I can go forever and never die. And then, so for anybody else that is theory crafting or designing their own thing, adhere to what the constraints of the format are. We talked about that in the last episode. And then within those constraints, look for the tool that you need to solve the problems that you have first, and then look for the stuff afterwards. I'm not a transformational sideboard plan. I incidentally came to Dreadnought because I wanted the other tools first. I'm saying that over and over because anytime somebody has the idea, oh, what about this card? Have you thought about this card? Have you tried this thing? Think about it within the framework of the thing you're trying to do, which is survive, and then the thing that you're trying to do after that, specifically against the certain things that you have problems with. Anything that surviving is not an option, like I cannot survive forever against the Karn One Ring decks because they bury me and then recoup way more cards than I do, and then lock me out from ever actually being able to do the thing to survive forever because they can just lattice lock you or whatever. In which case you actually can't take game actions. Like if you can't survive against not taking game actions, okay, well then that requires the pivot. Yeah, and then we pivot.
You have to close the door before they put out, the ensnaring bridge or what have you.
Right, but if I'm playing, it's only against that type of I'm not trying to be a Dreadnought pivot plan. I'm trying to be Dreadnought as the threat against the deck I need threats against because me going forever can't work because their plan inherently stops me doing that. So if I board in all of my Dress Downs against other Urza Saga decks like Painter, I'm not bringing in my Dreadnoughts against that deck. I don't need it.
Yeah,
my plan of going forever will still work. So I'm not trying to become this other deck to get them afterwards. I'm no, my inherent plan against them is still good enough. It's only when it's not that I pivot.
Your discipline on this sideboard plan is really what's going to test whether or not it works, because I would not have discipline to be oh, I don't need to just shut the door. This is my tempo deck player mentality. My mantra is the best way to survive against your opponent is by making them not survive. So I would be yeah, I'm a post-sideboard Dreadnought deck every single time. And this is sort of the plan. So, I talked last week about going 3-1 in the local. The deck that beat me was a Doomsday Reanimator deck that just, pivoted, watched me play my sideboard like a mook. I got completely blown out by the fact that my opponent was just physically watching me sideboard in and out stuff and was just yep. He moved 4 cards out, 4 cards in. They could be dazes or they could be 4, graveyard hate cards. So, figuring out what your discipline in is on the sideboard plan, knowing, as a control player, what you're better against and when we're suited to play against for these things. But for me, I would always be in that situation of trying to play the transformative sideboard and then making my opponent guess, because they're going to side out their removal against a deck like yours, right? So it's just sure, now you're playing Dreadnoughts. Then they bring in all the removal, you side everything out, or whatnot. Maybe one way or the other.
That plan of they board the removal out, they board the removal in. That is also assuming that they respect what you're doing. And we had talked 3 episodes ago about the whole premise was that players don't have to respect what control is doing.
Exactly. Yeah. But that is the thing. So if you can make them respect what you're doing by making them respect the wrong things, that might be the way to go.
The plan is if we were to zoom out on ABC deck building, let's zoom out from an individual card level as to how to make a deck, and let's look at ABC deck building from a macro standpoint. Okay, so for the control shell that I'm always tinkering with and trying to build, and my theory crafting behind why I'm doing it, that thing that I just talked about being able to go forever. Like I will endure against anything forever. From a macro standpoint, like that's different from what you just said of your idea is I want to get them dead as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If we just zoom out for control on ABC deck building, if the legacy power level thing to do is endure forever, therefore what do I want? Which is this package that I built in this deck, right? So far, right? If I want to, if it
That
is
the
a
argument,
legacy power,
for sure.
if legacy power level thing that I can do is never die to anything, deterministically.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, this package is the thing that gets me there. Like you can,
Yep.
you know, if you zoom out on the theory, you can be like, okay, this is how this is working to be able to determine card choices.
And then C becomes Phyrexian Dreadnought.
And then like I want to last forever, therefore I want this package, and then that package then says, okay, then what are the tools within that, like those things can get? So if I want Mystic Sanctuary, Thwart, Argivian Find, thing that can recur lands, okay, then what are the things that it can go get, right? And that just happens to be the most reliable tools that help you survive. And that's where we're getting like Source to Plowshares, Dress Down, you know, like those types of things for the given format. But like we start at this theory, the tools for that theory, the tools within those tools that can actually perform the actions. But like so you have the theory, you have the shell, you have the tools. Like if we're looking at how that operates, that then can inform, you know, how to design without getting lost in the weeds. Because you can, you know, it's like what are you actually trying to accomplish? I'm not, and then you know when you're actually trying to solve like the individual problems that like subvert that theory, right? Like if the legacy power level thing to do can't actually happen, which is survive or endure because something like Lattice Lock exists, then you're like, okay, that's where I have to pivot off of it into something else, and that's where we get something like the Dreadnought plan. But like from the standpoint going in the dark, in the blind, when I sit down at a table, I'm going, does this hand with the theory that I have built presume that I can endure against actual fucking anything?
All right. Well, what do you think? Is Terminus still a legacy power level thing to do? Comment below with your opinion and roast Phil while you're at it. Thank you everybody for watching, and we will catch you on the next one. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button. It grows the legacy content ecosystem we all love by relaying to the platform that you are part of our passionate community.
And to go even further, click the links for subscription or to support directly via Patreon to help us create more content for you. Patreon supporters get 4 exclusive extra episodes per month. If you're listening on an audio platform, head over to patreon.com/eternaldurdles.
Thanks so much for your support.
We'll see you in the next one.